Of all the world's continents, Australia may be the smallest, but it's also the only one to be entirely controlled by just a single country. Almost everybody knows, though, that while Australia is a huge place in terms of land, it's also a pretty small place in terms of population. But few people really understand the absolute scale of how sparsely populated the Australian continent actually is. To help put the numbers into some perspective, Australia is of a comparable size to the lower 48 US states. These 48 US states have a population of more than 300 million people, while Australia only has a population of little more than 26 million. This means that there are 2 American states that have more people than the entirety of the Australian continent. California with more than 39 million, and Texas with more than 28 million. For a more European perspective, the population of only England, without factoring in any of the rest of the UK, is more than double the entire population of Australia. Australia is therefore among the most heavily urbanized nations in the world, with the overwhelming majority of the population, around 90%, concentrated into relatively small urban areas that only account for 0.22% of Australia's total land area. Around 85% of all Australians live within just 50 kilometers of the coastline, meaning that there's hardly anyone deeper into the continent's vast interior. Australia is really empty. And to hammer the point home even further, consider the towns of Esperance on the south coast and Kununurra near to the north coast. Both of these towns are within the same state of Western Australia, and it takes at least 35 hours of time to drive from one to the other across a distance of more than 3,200 kilometers. And along that entire distance in time, you'll maybe only drive through a population of less than 70,000 people the entire way. What is it about Australia that makes it such an overall empty void of people? Well, the easy answer that I'm sure most of you are thinking right now is the desert. Duh. Everybody knows that Australia is covered in a big old desert with tons of super dangerous animals and insects. Who would ever want to actually live in most of the country? And while there is some truth to this line of thinking, I am here to argue with you that that's only a small part of the overall population puzzle in Australia, and the full explanation for why there are so few people on this continent is overall a pretty complicated one. Most of the problem stems from the fact that Australia is pretty uniquely cursed when it comes to both the geologic and location perspective. There are simply very few tall mountains to be found anywhere on the continent that are actually capable of forcing air upwards where it's possible to cool into rain. And then, to make matters even worse, that air is very often just too hot for rain to form anyway, because the continent straddles the boundary of the Tropic of Capricorn, placing a significant amount of northern Australia to be well within the tropics, and almost the rest of the continent down in the subtropic. This area of the world is dominated by the subtropical high-pressure belt that wraps around the entire globe, and it simultaneously serves to both warm and dry the air around it. So whatever air even does get pushed up by the few tall mountains in Australia has to also contend with this phenomenon. These factors converge to make Australia by far the driest inhabited continent on the Earth, with the least amount of average annual rainfall, and consequently, desert or desert-like conditions understandably exist over about 35% of the continent's total area. Just take a look at this map of Australia's average rates of annual rainfall, where you can see most of the rain on the continent falls on the east coast in the stretch of land between the coastline and the Great Dividing Range, in the north that stretches into the tropics, Tasmania in the south, and around Perth in the southwest corner. It's basically an identical map with Australia's current population density pattern. 9 of the 10 hottest recorded years in the continent's history have taken place just since 2005. These higher temperatures are rapidly increasing the rates of evaporation throughout the waters of the basin, and with already limited rainfall throughout the majority of it, it's making the water here increasingly scarce, with some sections of the basin at times remaining completely dry for months on end. And it's not just the scarcity of fresh water on the continent that makes sustaining a very large population difficult. It's also the scarcity of good land for farming and agriculture, owing once again largely to geography, geology, and location. Despite everything, it turns out that Australia actually has a ton of freshwater resources. Well, at least when compared to countries and not to continents. In fact, Australia has an estimated 492 cubic kilometers worth of renewable freshwater resources, which is more than a lot of countries with significantly higher populations. That's twice as much as Pakistan, for example, a country which has more than 8 times as many people. So it's not just a sheer lack of fresh water, and it's not just a sheer lack of arable land either. While, yeah, only about 6% of Australia's land is actually arable and suitable for agriculture, Australia is huge. So that 6% is still a ton of usable farmland. Australia has by far the highest ratio in the entire world of arable land to population at around 1.9 arable hectares of land for every 1 citizen of the country. For the sake of comparison, the ratio in the United States is only about 0.47 arable hectares of land per 1 citizen. This means that if Australia ever reached the same ratio of arable land to people as the United States, the continent would be home to well over 90 million people. Still substantially less than the population of America, but also substantially more people than Australia has today. In theory, Australia does have enough space and resources to support a lot more people than the 26 million who live there today. The big reason why it doesn't is because for pretty much the entire history of Australia, right up until the present day, it's just been a really tough place for anyone to actually get to. You see, for millions of years now, Australia has been effectively a lost continent, isolated from all the Earth's other major landmasses, drifting alone out in the sea. This has resulted in millions of years of completely separate evolution for the animals of the continent, which is why Australia is unique among Earth's continents for the fact that marsupials, and not placental mammals, dominate the indigenous mammal wildlife species. For most of Australia's history, immigration came almost entirely from just a single source: the British Isles. Following the discovery of gold on the continent in 1851, a massive gold rush to Australia ensued that saw around 2% of the entire population of the British Isles emigrate to Australia throughout the decade of the 1850s, and more than doubled the Australian population almost overnight. But Australia struggled to attract large numbers of immigrants from Europe afterwards, because it was heavily competing for them with more attractive countries in the Americas like the United States, Canada, Brazil, and Argentina, who were much closer to Europe geographically and were thus generally cheaper and quicker for Europeans to emigrate to. It didn't help that beginning in 1901, the Australian government enacted a policy that would artificially reduce their numbers of immigrants to the continent for decades: the racist White Australia policy, which restricted immigration to only people of white, European ancestry, and initially gave overwhelming preference to migrants coming specifically from Britain. As a result, the flow of immigrants to the continent remained only a trickle of people for decades across the early 20th century, while at the same time, millions of immigrants were arriving in the United States every couple of years. Before 1945, almost all the immigrants to Australia came from either Great Britain or Ireland. But after the war, Australia for the very first time began encouraging immigration from across the European continent. The policies restricting immigration largely only to Britons were gradually relaxed to be more inclusive of all Europeans, and by the 1960s, 3 million mainland Europeans from places like the Baltic states, Poland, Italy, the Balkans, and Greece packed up their bags and headed to Australia to begin a brand new life, many of them being displaced refugees from the war. But the exclusion of non-whites as immigrants to the continent remained largely in force for several more decades even after the war. It wasn't until 1973, nearly 3 decades after the end of World War II, that the White Australia policy was finally overturned and race ceased being a factor in the continent's immigration policy. Ever since, Australia has maintained an official policy of multiculturalism and has welcomed large-scale, multi-ethnic immigration for decades from all across the world. And now, in the 21st century, the vast majority of new immigrants to the continent come from Asia and not from Europe, especially from China and India. Today, Australia caps the new numbers of immigrants to the continent at less than 200,000 a year, which, for a country of only 26 million, is actually a pretty consistently high rate of immigration. As of 2022, nearly 1 in 3 people on the Australian continent was born outside of it, which is by far the highest proportion of immigrants found in the population of any developed Western nation. Australia today is a proud nation of immigrants from all across the world, and by 2050, the continent's population is projected to increase up to around 36 million. About the same as Canada today, and largely through continued immigration. But the growth over the next 2 decades will not come without its challenges. The continent's ancient natural challenges like unpredictable rainfall, drying rivers, droughts, and vast arid wilderness, along with new challenges like the uncertain course of climate change, mean that Australia has an epic battle against its own environment ahead of it to continue increasing their population.